large document, which I think by the end of this, I'm hoping this won't seem intimidating at all, but you'll have a really good sense of how to use it, how to reference it, and use this as a key resource for your committee's conversations.
Dog ear it. Mark it up.
And so as Ellen mentioned, right, this is a reauthorization of the Farm to Plate Investment Program, and the legislation itself has 3 legislatively defined outcomes. And the thing to keep in mind about that is this document really takes those 3 outcomes and instills them throughout it. So you'll sort of find the character of those 3 outcomes across this, and those 3 are. You can see them first. They appear first on page 6. They appear elsewhere as well. But on page 6, you'll see that it is increase sustainable economic development and create jobs in Vermont's food and farm sector is outcome 1. Outcome 2 is to improve soils, water, and resiliency of the working landscape in the face of climate change. And then 3 is improve access to healthy local foods for all Vermonters. So in that, you have kind of the 3 components of sustainable economic development. You've got economy, environment, and social dimensions. And then know too that we have added a commitment to racial equity as another key outcome and category of this plan, because really those 3 can't happen without deliberate attention to racial equity as well. And then you'll find that there's a page understanding the plan, which outlines all of the different elements, and know that so we start with a vision, right? This is what we expect, we want to see by 2030. If we accomplish everything, it's the world we will be living in. And that's really what the vision encompasses. Then the strategic goals are the next layer down. So there's 15 strategic goals. Those goals, which I'll go over a little bit more, but they're organized by those 4 categories. Then there's objective measures. So each goal then has an actual measurable objective or objectives associated with it. Those are the things that we'll report to this committee on an annual basis around. So those will be the qualitative or the quantitative, well, in some cases, 2 qualitative elements that let us know, are we making progress? Right? They help us answer that question. They don't in entirety answer that question, but they help us sort of point us in the right direction as to the progress we're making. And then we start getting more into the actual strategies, the things that we need to do in order to reach those goals and objectives. And so those are the priority strategies. There's 34 of those. And those 34, which I'll go into even further in a little bit, are a synthesis of what are 276 recommendations that come from product, market, and issue briefs, which are the back sort of half of this document. So I'll explain that also more as we go along. And so those priority strategies, in being a synthesis, really represent areas where if we focus on implementing a priority strategy, it's going to impact a lot of different elements of recommendations that are contained in the briefs. So those are really the high impact, high leverage strategies. And that takes, of course, the form of programs, investments, policies. So that's the area that the substantive conversation today, where you want to focus on going over those priority strategies for the committee, because that is where I think there's a lot of policy implications where the legislature can impact things on the strategies. So I was hoping you could actually post this up at some point. So this is I printed out a copy of the vision. I'm not going to read it, but in essence, if you ever need inspiration or a reminder of what we're all here doing, that vision was created by the input of 1,500 Vermonters. So it really takes the voice of people in Vermont and tries to articulate that into a succinct vision that covers the environment, the economy, social and racial equity.
It's on page 11 of the plan.
Right.
So.
Thanks.
All right. And so as I mentioned, on page 13 is where you'll start to see the introduction to the strategic goals. And you'll see that these goals are categorized by the 4 categories. So sustainable economic development, environmental sustainability, healthy local food for all Vermonters, and racial equity. And then as you turn the page, you'll see the 15, each of them written out. And I think the thing to keep in mind for, say, the economic development goals, that's based around employment, economic output, but also the standards of employees that are working in the food system, and also the ability of employers to find the skilled workforce that they need. So that's what those 5 roughly, the dimensions that it covers, and also the need to diversify our production portfolio. So that, we're not just reliant on right now, as we predominantly are, dairy as the source of our, the economic engine of the working landscape. So we really want to try to diversify that portfolio over the next 10 years. Then the environmental sustainability goals we'll get into more around increasing carbon sequestration, adaptation of our farmland, building out the resiliency to extreme weather, also compensating and recognizing the positive contributions of our farm stewards for the ecological benefits that they produce. As we were talking about before the break, is keeping our land in agricultural production, and making sure too that land use policy is supporting that. And then the last one in that set of goals is around the management of food scraps, edible food residuals for their highest purpose, which is an issue that right now is a hot button topic when we're talking about contaminants in the soil and depacking. And so I know there's a lot of conversations around that, and that's a goal that is policy that's definitely related to that goal. Then you get into the access related goals. So this is producing more food that meets the dietary and cultural needs of people in Vermont. That means ensuring that people have the financial resources to access local food, that they have the transportation resources to access local food, that they have the knowledge base to whether it's store, grow, hunt, fish for local food, and then also that our food system is resilient to emergencies. You could think of that as the pandemic. You could think of that as climate change. And my colleague Becca Warren here will have a lot more to say about food security, and hopefully you'll hear more from her about that issue and the planning process for ensuring that resilience at a later date. And then the last goal is related to a commitment to eradicating structural racism through all of our work in the food system, and really elevating the leadership, participation, representation of BIPOC in those efforts, and supporting what they're already doing. So those are the goals. Those are the kind of roughly the issues that they cover. So you can see where it's a whole systems approach. I'm not going to go into now all of the objectives associated with each of these goals, but just know that there then are a set of metrics that we're tracking over time and we'll be reporting on. And that is what the next 16 through pages 25, 26 will cover. And feel free, as you start looking through this and picking out things, you might have questions about any of these objectives and the data behind it or anything else. Please do ask questions about.
Can I interrupt just for a second? So each goal has a certain number of objectives.
Yep.
And my question, I guess, is whether in 2011, when the first plan was put together, was it structured the same way? Were there?
Similarly, but slightly different. It wasn't laid out in this manner, but there was a similar idea. We're just being a little more deliberate in how we're presenting it in this plan. And so in that way too, creating an expectation for you all that these are going to be the data that we will be providing and reporting on over time. Okay. Now, before we go more into substance of the priority strategies, which starts on page 29. I want to help refer to something that's actually on the back of this document. So as I mentioned, each of the priority strategies is a synthesis of many recommendations. And in the back on page 193, you'll see a table of priority strategies with source reference. So here you can see the individual recommendations, the component recommendations from briefs. That's the second column. Those are the individual recommendations that feed into the synthesis priority strategy. And so in this way, the strategic plan, you can start from an individual recommendation in this table, right? If you're really interested in, say, agroforestry, and you want to look at those recommendations, there's an agroforestry brief that's somewhere in these pages. And then you can see where those recommendations then connect to a priority strategy. So like, how does it then feed into some of these higher order strategies, goals, et cetera. So you can start from the top, the vision, down to the goals, down to the individual recommendations, or you can go the other way, or you can over time choose your own adventure and start where you want to. But just so know, there is an accounting though of kind of where those recommendations, the recommendations that make up a priority strategy. So with that being said, as you look at this priority strategy list, just first know that you'll see some
Pages 30, 31, 32, 33, 34.
You'll see that there are icons, little color-coded icons with numbers. So those are referencing then or making the connection to the specific goal and goal area that priority strategy is oriented to achieving. So if we do if this priority strategy is implemented, it will impact those goals and those category areas. So that's the thinking of it, and just knowing that there's a lot of these interconnections between each element of the strategic plan. So I'm going to now shift into more like now content. So if there are any just questions about structure or any initial reflections or reactions, this might be a good time. And if not, great.
Any questions on structure? Okay, we'll move into content.
All right, awesome. So I'm going to focus on the things that I'm guessing are of interest, but certainly, I could be very well far off on that. So I am going to be selective, just so you know, I'm not going to go over everything. So priority strategy number 1 is about increasing base funding for WeLab to at least $1.5 million. Of course, there is a proposal this year to make that $5 million, and we were careful in saying at least 1.5 because the more the better. Working Lands is a critical source of funding to drive a lot of the infrastructure investment that we need, the transitions in our agricultural system. And having that base amount be predictable and stable is also really important. Just thinking about it from a business planning standpoint, knowing that there's going to be, $5 million for 5 years is a lot different than, it might be 600 next year, it might be 1 million the year after. And how do you plan for that as a business becomes more difficult. So that predictability is really critical. And that's why, we were trying to, in this strategy, really convey the sense of increasing and stabilizing that base funding. The priority strategies 2 and 3, both implicitly and explicitly get to a lot of racial equity, the racial equity goal, and supporting the funding and financing mechanisms that are required for land access to make that more equitable, and also to dedicate more resources for BIPOC specifically to address historic inequities in funding and financing. And the land, a lot of the conversations around the Land Access Opportunity Board which is due to release a report soon, are really connected and tied to those two priority strategies. So those, what they are recommending in that report is definitely aligned with those two particular priority strategies. Moving on to the priority strategy 5 is about really tied into the stabilization, revitalization of dairy, a lot of the work right now that's happening through the Dairy Business Innovation Center is helping to advance a lot of the transformations that are needed in the dairy supply chain, the differentiation that needs to happen in the dairy industry. So I think really thinking about how the work of this committee can be consistent and compatible with the work that they're advancing is really important. And also, I'd be remiss not to mention too that right now, organic dairy is experiencing considerable a crisis of sort of an unprecedented crisis due to on one hand climate change, which is increasing the cost of feed. Mentioned drought in the West and Midwest, so organic feed supply is hard to come by and prices are really high, and then inflationary pressures for fuel and other inputs. So I know there's going to be a lot more conversation about that, and definitely it is a critical need as we are losing organic dairies at a really frightening rate right now. Priority strategy 6 is around meat processing infrastructure. So a lot of modernization that needs to happen in our existing facilities, equipment that can help improve efficiencies, also safety of the workforce. In addition to needing potentially new processing capacity. You mentioned small ruminants. So a lot of facilities now are specializing in just one animal type. So you have facilities that are now switching over to just beef, that have stopped processing pork, for example. You have many that have stopped processing small ruminants. So there's a lot of potential for investment in that space, and that in turn helps create access for our livestock producers and makes that industry more viable. Gives the dairy industry also other alternatives to diversify or transition. 7 and 8 are about if you want to look at by specific product types, you'll see there are a lot of needs around investment in storage, processing, distribution infrastructure, support for, and I think the thing to take away from number 8 is that a lot of very product industry specific needs for each, for processing. So, what the meat industry needs for processing infrastructure is different from what the produce industry needs. But what they can all benefit from is investment in storage and distribution. So, the more ability we have to move food efficiently from point of production to market, that makes the system stronger and more viable. Number 9, and we were touching upon this with the conservation of land conversation, but that priority strategy is really looking at farmland access and conservation, expanding funding, trying to create innovative financing and funding mechanisms to make land access more affordable. And that too also has connections to equity and what a lot of conversations happening with the Land Access Opportunity Board, right? Alternative models for ownership. It's much, as I was saying, it's much harder for, say, someone to buy a 200-acre property when really what they're looking for is 10 acres and different infrastructure. So we're seeing a greater need for potentially collaborative approaches for land ownership, and potentially funding to pilot different approaches or support the working out legal and financial arrangements around that is key. 11 and 12, just to note that all of the work of increasing production or making our farm and food businesses more viable requires a lot of technical assistance. And that can take the form of business planning, transition planning, access to capital, but also very specific production expertise that's needed. And that's something that we lack a lot of specialization or depth of specialization for livestock production, or Heather Darby's doing great work around grains, but she could use a lot more capacity, produce. There's a large list of TA needs that are defined in the briefs and that these two priority strategies capture. And again, just another area of how can we help support the development of those positions is a real need in the system. Moving to 16 and 17, those are oriented around marketing. And the way that we've split that out is that there is marketing support in a general way that's needed of, how do we increase the presence of, whether you want to call it the Vermont brand or just Vermont products in out-of-state markets and in-state markets, right? That broad-based marketing is something that doesn't have a lot of resources behind it. And that, whether you're talking about Department of Tourism and Marketing or the Agency of Agriculture itself, not having a lot of marketing specific appropriations, that's an area of need. And then there's also, the marketing acumen of our producers needing, more training or access to affordable marketing services. So a lot of, small businesses, it's really hard to access the upper echelon of marketing expertise. So, finding creative ways to open up access to those services is another key element of the marketing conversation. Then turning the page, so on 32, something that is now being actively discussed legislatively. So Priority Strategy 20 is incentivizing local purchasing for K through 12 schools. That there's a need to make that funding secure and permanent. And that would fulfill one of our priority strategies of the 10-year strategic plan. In addition to that, there's a lot of requests this year for funding for existing programs that help alleviate food insecurity. So universal school meals, that's number 22, farm to school, and other crop cash would be another one, right? Programs that are in place but just need additional support because there's huge demand for them. And universal school meals is also, helps achieve that third legislative outcome of access to local healthy food for all Vermonters, right? Really creating equitable access through our school system. And then just to note that 23 is about building cross-sector coalitions. So we talked about where does that coordination come from? These issues are multi-system, a lot of overlapping issues. So there is a recognition through Priority Strategy 23 and some of the work that we're trying to do through the Farm to Plate Network is to build those cross-sector coalitions with healthcare, with transportation, with housing. And so that is just identified as a big barrier. Certainly healthcare, childcare impacts our farmers and our food businesses in a lot of different ways. And then
How are you guys doing?
yes.
I haven't seen any hands. I think we're good to keep
Okay.
going. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for.
I think it's good just because just to cover the full spectrum, and then we can obviously go in more detail on any of these. So Priority Strategy 24 is about this development of a food security plan, which Becca Warren is leading the effort to do that. That is happening. And there will be, the final roadmap will be available at the end of the year. And so with that, we're hoping a lot of policy recommendations and other recommendations to implement will come through that process and be available at the end of the year. But there's also, a number of efforts already and legislative proposals this year that, really help us achieve a lot of things that will be discussed in the food security plan. And so, we're hoping you will all hear much more about that process and some of the preliminary findings. And some of that will be previewed in our annual report presentation. So I'll just say 26 and 27. 26 is really oriented around climate change, enhancing the climate adaptive practices of our agricultural landscape. And so that, comes through innovative funding, which could be state-based. It could be innovative private financing. And, I know there's some effort right now through the PES working group, making some recommendations around a CSP Plus program. So, yeah.
Those two acronyms?
Yes, yes. So the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group, which has been meeting now for maybe the last 2 years.
More than that.
Maybe 3.
3.
So they, a body that was created through legislation, and they are now at a point at which they are making recommendations, one of which is there's a conservation stewardship program through USDA. Sorry, it's really hard. And it's really hard.
We know that one.
Yeah. And part of that proposal is asking the state to sort of provide an adder to what USDA provides in the pricing. And the more that we can, reward climate adaptive practices, the better, and create also just other ways in which farms can be compensated and bring in additional streams of revenue is really important part, I think, of the future of the business model of farming in Vermont. So that's 26 and 27, and also know too that I was served on a subcommittee of the Climate Council that was related to forestry and agriculture. And so there are a lot of recommendations in the Climate Action Plan that are adaptations of recommendations from this strategic plan. So,
And the reason for that is,
well, I was going to say, I'm curious what you were going to say.
because Jake served on that committee. So what we really worked at doing is when that planning process was happening, Jake was in the room to bring forward the recommendations from this plan to be in the climate action plan. So there was alignment. And my serving on the Governor's Commission on the Future of Agriculture, this is the document that everything starts with. And then all the recommendations that are given to the governor ultimately can be tied back to this plan in one way or another too. So in that way, what we're really trying to do is we're all speaking basically from the same playbook. There's lots of different nuances and different lanes that there's the orchestra part, there's the trumpets part, there's lots of different parts and pieces of that orchestra, but we're all working from the same playbook and headed in the same direction. So sorry, I just wanted to tie that together.
I would also say that I did not, literally demand,
Right.
people were, the people on the committee were really interested in making sure that integration existed, and also saw that this plan in a lot of ways was a climate adaptive, climate mitigation plan as well for agriculture, that already the recommendations were there. And, I would say too, then the other opportunity is how can we make the climate action plan a plan that supports Vermont agriculture, right? That now the seeds are there, but how do we really make that reality?
I think that's actually good to know. And you're reminding us that you served on the Governor's Future of Ag, which I was wondering whether the recommendations were consistent from one set of documents to the other. So it's good to know that it sounds like they are, for the most part anyway.
Yeah.
Representative O'Brien had a question.
No, so you don't sit on the Payment for Ecosystems Working Group?
No.
Nobody's on that, but have they used you as a resource, because you're an aggregator of experts?
Yeah, and we're definitely in conversations with a lot of people who are on yeah, on the PES working group for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, just lastly, again, there's even things I'm skipping over here, but if 33 and 34 represent the priority strategies around racial equity, eradicating structural racism in the food system, really elevating, compensating leadership, participation, representation of BIPOC. And then 34 is also a call for resources for, more research, data collection, investigation of racial equity in Vermont's food system specifically. One of the things that the team that wrote the racial equity brief found was that, there is a lack of information around racial equity as it relates to the food system. So it's hard to say certain things about it, but we know that there's certainly the racism and inequity does exist in the food system and in the food system in Vermont as well. So that is my quick overview of priority strategies that I think have particular relevance to the work of the committee. And then I'll just say that as I mentioned, there are then individual, what we call briefs. So if you want to know more about, say, the infrastructure needs of beef or grains, there is a product brief for each of those, as there is for vegetables and other types of products that gets into more detail about, the specific industry needs of that industry. So you can, again, kind of get into more granularity about an issue or a product area and investigate it, in a little more specific way. And also that may help you identify, key questions that you might want to bring people to testify on related to an industry or a market issue as an example.
You gonna go to the table of contents?
Yeah, so there is a table of contents for the briefs. Let me I didn't dog ear it.
Page 39, page 39 for the product briefs.
Yeah, and that was also, I wanted to make this point that, a lot of this document, the pages is actually those briefs, because we do cover, a significant portion of product areas, but those briefs themselves, each one is only 2 pages. So meant to be very accessible, something you can quickly reference and understand. And they're structured all in the same way. So they have a statement about what's at stake, kind of puts the issue into context. They give some current conditions, which references data, important data. Then it identifies bottlenecks and gaps, opportunities, and then the recommendations. And then those recommendations are in that reference table that is at the back. And yeah.
And there are, so there's these product briefs. And then there are also what we call market briefs, which start on page 99. There's a table of contents for the market briefs, and that covers all the different types of markets, including major metropolitan areas, looking at the opportunity for selling outside the state. And then starting on page 121, then there's a series of what we call issue briefs. The things like that access to capital continuum that I mentioned, succession, agritourism, climate change, consumer demand, racial equity, tax and legal services, water quality, business and technical assistance. So again, it gives you that snapshot. So you have somebody that comes in to testify, and let's say they're talking about the lack of meat processing facilities. It's in the product. One of the product briefs is on meat and slaughter. Is that in the issue brief?
It's a product.
A product brief. And then you can also look at the individual meat, livestock, so there's a hogs, there's a grass-fed beef, as Jake said, there's goats and sheep. one. So, so that you can, as somebody that might be testifying, if you want to learn more, this is a reference document that you can dig into. You get a quick 2-page snapshot of what's going on. Hopefully they're referencing it too, but you never know. And one of the things that I think is important to just add to what Jake's talking about in terms of the structure, these briefs were written by subject matter experts. So we went out and found a lead author. Becca actually, prior to working on the food security plan, was actually project managing this whole development process. You'll see on the bottom in the footer of each one of these, there's the lead author, and then there's what's considered contributing authors. So we asked the lead authors that we cajoled, paid, volunteered to write these, to have somewhere in the 5 to 8 individual additional contributing authors, at least 3 of whom we wanted to have from the private sector. So we really wanted this to be grounded in what people who really know this topic and know it well because they live it, right? They have some actual direct experience with it, wrote this. We wanted to come up with something that any farmer, value-added food producer, distributor who read the brief about them and their business would say, yeah, that's pretty much right. I quibble about this, I quibble about that, but yeah, it's basically representative of what's going on right now. So that you could have confidence that this was not like Jake and I sitting back in some back room, like typing this stuff up. Like this actually came from folks in the field with the subject matter expertise. So Laura Ginsberg, who works at the Agency of Agriculture and is now the dairy chief, taking over for Diane Bothfeld, who's retiring, she wrote the 8-page dairy one. That's the only one. It's an 8-pager for dairy. And worked with a group of other dairy farmers to write that brief on dairy, for instance.
Do the briefs tie in, are they connected to the strategies or the objectives? Are they coded somehow?
Yes, so that was
Yeah, that's the table that starts on
193.
193.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that earlier.
Yes.
Yep.
It's easy to, now you can see now how it all connects. Yep. So we didn't number the recommendations in the briefs, but if you just count the bullets, it's the same thing.
I think too that you'll see that some of the priority strategies they might be very prescriptive and clear as to like what the action is. Others, it might be more general in a way that there is more room for interpretation or defining the specific, say, policy that needs to happen or the program. And that's, just based on our assessment of understanding the issue and how clear of a recommendation we felt we could make about a particular strategy. So there is definitely within the priority strategies room for interpretation or further development of concepts and ideas and policies.
Which is really then what the Governor's Commission on the Future of Ag did, right? They, in some cases, like last year's report that was able to be released, the governor agreed to let it be released, called for an increase in funding for the Working Lands Enterprise Fund. He put in some money to his budget request last year, but the legislature went farther then, right? So again, it's all intended to be like, try to get everybody basically moving in the right direction. The Governor's Commission on the Future of Ag had a number of, and you'll hear this probably talking with the secretary, had a number of panelists that came in, but they had the grounding in this first. Then they had panelists come in and then they worked in committees to massage and say, all right, this year to the governor, this is going to be our ask. And that report went into the governor in November. Hopefully we'll hear a little bit about whether or not he has any of those recommendations in his budget address next week. And then hopefully after that, he'll agree to let that report come out and you all can see it and you can work with that as well.
Great. So are there other questions for Jake or about the this volume.
And I apologize. I'm not looking to get sidetracked. But what struck me about the collective presentations, and it's been riveting, but as an observer of life in our society, I find this remarkably unjudgmental with regard to there are camps in society that vegans are the only enlightened people, or carnivores are like the lowest of the low.
It's all in there.
But it is all in here, so I'm just curious from activists in one camp or the other, have you experienced any pressure because climate issues are often part of the argument for what's good for life on Earth and what isn't. Were you ever under pressure to underplay beef and pork or hogs?
Oh, right. Bees.
What do you mean?
Bees. Meaning we weren't originally not planning to do something on bees and honey. And when that became known, then they were very concerned that we didn't have something on bees and honey. And so therefore we do have, in fact, a brief on bees and honey, which of course is really key. I mean, pollinators is very important, and it was an oversight on our part. So we said, okay, we'll do that. But no, I mean, I don't remember any.
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it's the art of the job that we have is knowing that there are different interests represented in our network and in Vermont and in the farming community. And I think trying to stay at a point of as neutral or as objective as we can be to say there's opportunities in all of these areas.
Thank you.
No, it's an important question, and that was the balance that we were trying to strike. So.
Representative Graham.
So, some of these breeds that recommend, okay, like, I'm just gonna use example of grass-fed beef.
Mm-hmm.
And, doesn't seem to be any enforcement in this field. You know, and I see a lot of meat labels, pasture growing. Then maybe in a little bitty.
Right.
Technically certified grass, but
Right.
when I was going to beef and trying to figure out a label, figure out pricing, I talked to NOFA and to find out what other grass-fed certified beef operations they were that I might be able to work with. If I was go grass-fed, there would be two in the state of Vermont that were actually certified. And the other one has a market in the neighboring state. So you can't get a premium in the state of Vermont at this time for grass-fed beef. So, but there's more cost. So how do you combat that? I mean,
It's not an easy question, I think, to answer because the problem exists at the federal level too. You've got beef that comes from Brazil that moves through a processing facility in the Midwest and gets labeled a product of the U.S. and is technically grass-fed because it was raised in, let's say, or even Argentina, right, where they have pastures year-round. So there's all sorts of labeling issues around pasture, grass-raised meat products writ large, and I think, you're raising the issue of. I think there is confusion in the marketplace about that and the use of the label and the enforcement of the term. that is also then diminishing potential premiums on the product.
But that would probably be something that we would want to get our federal delegation to take on, because really it has to get solved at the national level, just like the organic standards were. And then have some kind of way of doing that enforcement if you're gonna have the actual stamp of grass-fed on your label. But right now, that doesn't exist. You're absolutely right.
Right, and you get the same response from feds as you get for label milk.
But
So to encourage people to do grass-fed beef is really not viable.
Well, also just as a clarification too about, so taking that issue into account, that this encompasses beef raised on pasture, not necessarily 100%, raised and finished. So that's what this brief is covering, the spectrum of grass-fed animals in the life cycle, not just 100%. Because an asset for Vermont is, we do have the ability to grow high quality grass forage. And it is a part of, the future of differentiating our meat products. That is some part of it. But there are issues of how does that actually position and achieve premium in the marketplace. So that is a challenge for sure.
That says the market for beef label grass-fed is growing. So
it is nationally.
one beef operation with a few animals that's actually grass-fed certified on the label.
Yep.
You can't compete with these people.
Yeah.
So it just should be beef.
Representative Pearl, did you have a follow-up to this
Yeah,
topic?
I was just
Then I'll get to.
gonna say that one way to combat that is ag education. And there's actually a brief on ag literacy, because I think obviously that's kind of talks about it a little bit in here, but about people not knowing what they're purchasing. And there's an admittance to that in some of the data, like it's 74% of people admit that they don't really know anything about the products that they're buying. So I would say that, I don't know, if it's more effective, I'm not gonna say easier, but it might be more effective to educate the consumer than try to change some policy stuff. Just a thought.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that you might need glasses to read the
Right.
label.
Yeah, there's a lot of research on labeling and the confusion that it creates, and adding more labels actually can be detrimental to the purpose in a lot of
Understanding,
ways.
yeah.
Whereas if people understand what they're buying initially, instead of relying on a label that's probably confusing to somebody who doesn't actually know what they're looking at, might be more effective.
Representative Templeman, you had another question?
Yeah, I was just gonna maybe not to say contrary to that, but are there any recommendations for certification or third-party certification or third-party inspection of process to assure and label and certify?
Not specifically in this brief, yeah. And there are third-party certifiers for grass-fed. So that isn't necessarily the issue. It may be cost and access to that certification process. And also maybe questions as to at this stage, what the premium is with this other confusion in the market on what constitutes a grass or who's labeling grass-fed. So it's complicated.
And there's also been over the years a lot of questions about quality, that speaks to with the lack of it's not just having a certification, it's also your management practices of those animals, your feeding nutrition practices, whether or not you're having the animal for a particular point in their life cycle or all throughout their entire life cycle. And so one of the things that we did through the Farm to Plate Network was sort of midway through was to actually look at, we were hearing that there were a lot of beef farmers who were like, am I really making any money at this? Whether they were grass-fed or other. And so one of the things that Jake led on, working with Jen Colby, who at the time was at UVM Extension, was to bring in this nationally amazing national school called Ranching for Profit. And for an entire week, they were holed up at what was then the Holiday Inn in South Burlington for an entire week with livestock producers. What was it, 12 from Vermont or 10 from Vermont? And then people as far away as Australia and Alberta and all across the country to really learn about how do you actually excel at being a grass farmer. Because if you grow really good grass, you're going to have high quality meat animals because of what it is that they're gaining from eating that grass, and healthy soils and all of that makes for good grass. And so one of the big parts of that program was to actually dial in on your financial data and your growing metrics around grass and such to really understand where can you make money. And in some cases, right, some of the folks that had been growing from calf to maturity got out of that, and they just focused on being the finishers, and some just focused on just raising the calves and then selling them to the next farmer in line based on what their land base was, based on what they were really good at doing as managers. And that really was a major eye-opener for a lot of folks who went through that program.
Representative O'Brien.
One of the things I can tell you we're gonna talk a lot about in this committee this year is that came up last time, is homesteading, micro farms, backyard farms.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at product groups, I think this is mostly aimed sort of farmer centric as far as the commodity you can.
Being in the business of farming, yes.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so was thought given, or down the road will it be given to, you know, what if all these things you can do at home, but it's much more about, you know, just what you're saying of Vermont feeding Vermont or New England feeding New England. If we had 50,000 people who all of a sudden started to raise a lot more of their food, you would accomplish those same goals, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of consuming
Exactly.
local food, yes.
Yeah. So how does that fit into this?
I mean, it does, that wasn't really the intention of these briefs and of the plan, because the goals, the outcomes that the legislature spoke to really were about growing the economic sector and jobs in the food system. But I think it does fit with the outcome of access to healthy local food for all Vermonters outcome. Backyard gardening, foraging, fishing, hunting is all part of it. For many years, we ran the Rooted in Vermont campaign, which was really trying to celebrate that whole part of our culture and heritage of this state, of recognizing that so many people were doing local food before it became sexy, right? And really celebrating that because it's real, it's important. It may become even more important as climate continues to change. And that's not to in any way, shape, or form detract from that. But I think you've got resources through NOFA Vermont, through UVM Extension, through online resources that can really be for like the person that wants to have a few chickens in their backyard, for instance. There are resources for that. We were really tasked by the legislature to grow this economic sector. And so we do tend to focus on what are the needs of farm and food businesses who are in the business of being in a business.
I would say, though, that goal 13 speaks to the point that
that's
you're
true.
making. So all people in Vermont can access the knowledge, skills, and resources to select, grow, hunt, fish, forage, process, store, and prepare local food.
Page 25.
And some of the objectives around that are, and we actually collect data on this through the Vermonter poll, is how many Vermonters in that report hunting, fishing, growing, foraging, raising livestock, and bartering. And that's something that we ask every year. So we do have long-term trends around that. And then that, of course, I think is tied to ag literacy and educational opportunities within K through 12. How are kids getting exposed to that and taking that home with them? And so I think that is in some ways captured, but is not the thing that we're looking to as the piece to fulfill the production goals that are defined here.
Have you ever seen data on how much of the food Vermont consumes is possibly raised at home?
We don't.
It is, I don't think it's comprehensively collected, which is why we don't report on it.
I do know that there have been some UVM researchers who've tried, I think, maybe to calculate or at least understand what the baseline of that might be. Because we've had some inquiries over the years on this Vermonter poll data, and kind of comparing that to some of the work that they've been doing. So there was some conversations about, like, in the next local food count, is there some way that you could actually even just estimate that percentage? Yeah.
But would you count it by calories, by weight, by dollar value of money or cash that you're not otherwise spending on that food?
Yeah.
There's a lot of really challenging assumptions that have to get sorted out to come up with what that value would actually be.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
Do I see
Interject.
Mr. Chair.
yes, if you would just, I'm not sure if we got you on the record before.
Yes,
so-
I just wanted, I'm Becca Warren, I work with the Sustainable Jobs Fund, and I wanted to reference, it's not a number of people who are homesteading or an amount of food, but I know that when the food bank testified earlier this week, they referenced the UVM research that's through the NFACT project that's looking at food security. One piece of research they've recently done includes asking whether people have increased their home food production during the pandemic. And I believe Carrie and John were going to send you that web link for those studies. And so there is information there about an increase in home food production in Vermont. What that amount is, and I'm terrible with numbers, so I don't know, don't ask, but not pounds of food or number of people, but.
Did you send that out, Gloria? Okay, so
It's on the committee page under the day that they were here, whatever day that was.
Great, yeah, I think I was Wednesday, maybe, earlier this week. Yeah. One more question for Representative Rice, if you have one.
Yeah, well, first, can you share that long-term data so we can see how the numbers have?
Yep. It will be in the annual report.
2 weeks.
Yeah.
I can't wait. I was just gonna ask if the 30 by 30 goal also shares the economic development piece, or if that would be a place where the growing food at home could play in more into that goal.
Yeah, I mean, and that goal, just to be clear, is just created by a small group of us that just said, let's put a flag in the sand that said, let's get to 30% by 2030. So there's no legislative mandate for it or anything like that. It is literally just a bunch of us that really want to see more regional food happening, right?
Yeah.
That said, just like in Vermont, it's really hard to know what the existing level is across the 6 New England states, but then also even what's really possible. Because, for instance, in urban centers, you have a lot of community gardens, like reclaimed lots that are being turned into urban farming. You have greenhouses, more vertical farming happening, for instance. So it is a portion of how you can get to 30%. But I think ultimately it's a very small percentage. I mean, right now we know for like direct like farmers markets and CSA sales in Vermont, you think about like, oh, there must be so much food. It's like 3% of our total ag farm gate sales is direct markets. Now, that's not to say that that's not significant. It's still a large dollar amount, but comparatively speaking, you've got a food system across New England that is $190 billion in value, right? 1 million people working in the food system across New England, the 6 New England states. You know, it's like, it matters for the people in, say, those urban areas because it is an important source of food and community and connection to the natural world that they might not otherwise get. But in terms of realistically being a major source of food, I think there's just too many of us.
Yeah. 74% of Vermonters acquiring local food through growing is an inspiringly high
It is.
number.
It is.
Feels
But what we don't know is how much are they actually growing? Like, are they having their herbs? Yeah, are they having a few tomato plants? They're growing some basil, they're making some pesto, you know, or are they actually really truly replacing, say, 20% of what they otherwise would be buying at a store? We just don't know.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about that, though, is that you might be able to say the correlation is that growing your own food does give you an appreciation
Yes.
for those who are growing it and you're purchasing from. So I think, it's just interesting the amount of local purchasing that is happening in Vermont. So there's, I feel like there's clearly a culture of appreciation for that and a willingness to do it, to put your hard-earned dollars down for locally made products. So I think that's where some of those figures can become, it's also inspiring is that it matters in other ways, that not just for providing for yourself, but supporting, the local economy too.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for
Well,
coming in.
thank
It
you.
will
A
give
lot of
us
time. Thank you so much.
Good context for when we hear the report in a couple of weeks. And I think we also just raised some interesting questions and there'll be follow-up on several things that we'll be doing anyway. And we may see you back again and maybe not you, Jake, beyond the annual report, but in other, as other things come up. So thank you. And I just got a few things going in the committee and but also wish you a good weekend.
Thank you so very much. And just so you know, these are limited edition. So, and they're not cheap to produce. So we're giving these to you to really use
I'm gonna read
and protect, guard, so that it can inform your important work. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
John, did you have a?
No, I just hope Ellen will come back for the New England meeting at some point.
I'm happy to, as soon as we're done with the final editing and layout. No, it's not, the report's not done yet, so we're closing in.
All right, awesome.
And then, yes, I would love to come back and talk about that, because we had 17 different researchers across the region working on that one. So, yeah, it's a big project. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Very good.
Nice to see you.
Alan, want this back?
No, it's yours.
I already have one.
Oh, sure.
Precious.
If you already have yours from last year and you want to repurpose it to another member that hasn't gotten it, that's great.
I want our library to have it too. We were talking with Abby about.
Go for
this, too. I'm sure this will be
Absolutely.
a hot
Yes.
read, actually.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I don't want to keep folks because I know it's Friday and we'll just a couple of things about next week. So I mentioned earlier, we're going to try and get together on Tuesday at 12:45. And in the meantime, we've talked about today, at least 2, maybe 3 reports that are coming out. So January 15th is a date that legislative reports are often due. That falls on Sunday. And I think they're getting them in this, the Friday ahead. So one of them is about the universal school meals. And on Tuesday, we're going to be hearing from the Agency of Education about that report. So before we hear from them at 12:45, we're going to have another member of Leg Council come in and just talk about a section of the legislation that we passed last year that we didn't go over with Mike earlier. That will hopefully just give us a little more context and better understanding for when we then talk about the report. And we're going to have the Education Committee joining us on, they're going to be in another room. They'll zoom in so that they can hear that testimony at the same time from the agency of ed. And then payment for equal services is the other report. Yeah.
Services.
Yes. So if that comes in, we'll get that out. If you don't see it in your email, it'll be there as soon as we get back in next week. Or you may be able to find it online too somewhere. Generally speaking, when we have information ahead of time, I don't think we've talked about this, Laura will post it on our committee page so that the night before you can look and see, oh, tomorrow we're taking this testimony. Here's something they're going to be presenting, and it might be helpful to look through it just to be better prepared. I don't know that we'll have anything beyond those reports for next week, but just as a general thing, you can look at it. So I think that's it. Anybody have any other parting thoughts or
We'll
questions?
get an agenda before Tuesday with,
I think we'll have one going out. It'll be posted and emailed out.
I'll do it on Monday,
okay,
or I could do it today.
It'll be tentative,
Yeah.
whatever, maybe a tentative agenda today. And
Okay.
that it's always a work in progress.
I've
Yeah.
noticed.
Yeah, even probably more so as we get going, as bills come in, we'll rearrange things. I think we try to give, just as a general rule for the public, as much notice as possible so that they know we're talking about something and can watch or come in if they want to. So we'll try not to make last minute changes, try not to, even that happens sometimes. So, yeah. Good.